The dust never seemed to settle in Leavenworth, Kansas, and neither did the whispers about Adelaide Zimmerman, the half-breed girl who scrubbed floors at the Riverside Hotel with hands that never quite looked clean no matter how hard she worked. It was 1878, and Adelaide had spent 21 years being reminded that her Shoshone mother's blood made her less than human in the eyes of most townsfolk, fit only for the kind of work that broke backs and crushed dreams into powder finer than the Kansas dirt that coated everything within 50 miles of the Missouri River. Mrs. Thornton, the hotel proprietress, had made it abundantly clear on Adelaide's first day of employment 7 years prior that she should harbor no illusions about her station in life. "You'll never be more than a servant, girl," the woman had said, her jowls quivering with the certainty of someone who believed the social order was as immutable as the rising sun. "Best you accept that now and save yourself the heartache of wanting more." Adelaide had accepted it, or told herself she had, scrubbing the same floors day after day, keeping her eyes down when the hotel guests passed, making herself as invisible as possible. Her mother had died bringing her into this world, and her father, a trapper named Jacob Zimmerman, had deposited her with the local minister's wife before drinking himself to death 2 winters later. She'd learned early that survival meant accepting whatever scraps of kindness came her way and expecting nothing more. The morning everything changed started like any other. Adelaide was on her knees in the hotel lobby, working a stubborn stain out of the floorboards near the entrance, when the doors swung open with enough force to rattle the glass. She didn't look up immediately, had trained herself not to, but she heard the heavy footfalls of boots and the jingle of spurs, heard Mrs. Thornton's voice shift from its usual harsh bark to something approaching civility. "Mr. Vance, what a pleasure. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Had better weather than anticipated," came the reply, a voice that carried the slight drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas but had shed most of the accent through travel. "Pushed through rather than camp another night." Adelaide kept scrubbing, but something made her glance up, just a quick flicker of her eyes. The man standing at the front desk was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked cattle and horses, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that sun and wind had weathered into something strong rather than handsome. He was maybe 28 or 30, dressed in worn but well-maintained clothing, and there was a kind of easiness to the way he stood that suggested a man comfortable in his own skin. "I'll have Sarah prepare your usual room," Mrs. Thornton was saying, then her voice sharpened. "Adelaide, stop gawking and fetch some fresh water for Mr. Vance's room. Now." Adelaide scrambled to her feet, nearly knocking over her bucket in her haste. She felt heat flood her cheeks as she hurried toward the back stairs, aware of how she must look in her threadbare dress with her dark braid coming loose and her hands red and raw from lye soap. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard Mrs. Thornton's voice, slightly lowered but still audible. "Pay her no mind, Mr. Vance. Half-breed girl. Good enough for the work, but you know how they are." Adelaide's hands tightened on the bucket handle until her knuckles went white, but she kept climbing. She'd heard worse, heard it so often the words should have lost their power to wound, but they never quite did. She was filling the pitcher in Mr. Vance's room when she heard the door open behind her. She turned, expecting Sarah or one of the other girls, and nearly dropped the pitcher when she found Mr. Vance himself standing in the doorway. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, and his voice was gentler than it had been downstairs, lacking the formal politeness he'd used with Mrs. Thornton. "I'm nearly finished, sir," Adelaide said quickly, setting the pitcher on the washstand with shaking hands. "I'll be out of your way." "You're not in my way." He stepped into the room, closing the door partway, and Adelaide's heart began to hammer. She'd learned to be wary of closed doors and men who looked at her too long. But when she finally dared to meet his eyes, there was nothing predatory in them, just a kind of thoughtful curiosity. "What's your name?" "Adelaide, sir. Adelaide Zimmerman." "That woman downstairs, the way she spoke to you and about you, does that happen often?" Adelaide didn't know how to answer that. The truth was dangerous, but lying to a hotel guest could get her dismissed. "Mrs. Thornton runs a respectable establishment, sir." "That's not what I asked." He moved to the window, looking out at the street below, giving her space. "I've been coming to this hotel twice a year for the past 5 years, bringing cattle up from Texas to sell. I've seen how she treats her staff. I've seen how the town treats anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. I don't mean to speak out of turn, sir, but I don't understand why you're telling me this." He turned back to her, and there was something in his expression that made her chest tighten, not with fear but with something she couldn't quite name. "Because I saw your face when she said those things. Because I know what it's like to be judged for circumstances beyond your control." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "My mother was Mexican. My father brought her to Texas when she was barely 16, and she spent the rest of her short life being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't white enough, wasn't anything enough." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "I'm sorry for your loss, sir." "Thomas," he said. "My name is Thomas Vance, and I'd appreciate it if you'd use it." "That wouldn't be proper, sir." "Plenty of things in this world aren't proper that should be, and plenty of things that are proper that shouldn't be." He smiled then, and it transformed his weathered face into something warm and open. "But I won't press you. I just wanted you to know that there's at least one person staying in this hotel who doesn't share Mrs. Thornton's opinions about anything." Adelaide didn't know what to say to that, so she bobbed her head and fled, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, scrubbing and cleaning and fetching with her mind miles away, replaying those few minutes in the hotel room over and over. Thomas Vance stayed for 3 days, and Adelaide found herself intensely aware of his presence in the hotel. She caught glimpses of him coming and going, heard his voice in the dining room, and twice more found herself face to face with him in the corridors. Each time he greeted her by name, asked her how she was faring, treated her like a person rather than a piece of furniture. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. On his last evening in town, Adelaide was hauling a basket of linens up the back stairs when she heard raised voices from the second-floor landing. She slowed her pace, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like an argument. "Your interest in that girl is unseemly, Mr. Vance." Mrs. Thornton's voice was sharp with disapproval. "People are starting to talk. Let them talk." Thomas's response was calm but firm. "I've done nothing improper. You speak to her. You treat her as though she were a guest rather than a servant. It gives her ideas above her station. Her station." Thomas's voice had gone cold now, and Adelaide heard the steel beneath the courtesy. "You mean her humanity, her right to be treated with basic dignity." "I mean her place in society. That girl's mother was a savage, Mr. Vance. Her father was a drunk who couldn't be bothered to raise her. She has no family, no prospects, no future beyond what service she can provide. It's not cruel to be realistic, it's kind. Better she understands her limitations now than harbor false hopes." Adelaide should have kept walking, should have retreated back down the stairs, but her feet had frozen in place. She clutched the basket of linens to her chest and waited to hear what Thomas would say, part of her expecting him to back down, to acknowledge that Mrs. Thornton was right, that Adelaide was foolish to think his kindness meant anything more than the transient charity of a man with a guilty conscience about his own heritage. "You're wrong," Thomas said quietly. "And cruel. That young woman works harder than anyone I've seen in this establishment. She's polite, capable, and from what I can tell, has more character in her little finger than most of the so-called respectable people in this town have in their entire bodies. If anyone has limitations, Mrs. Thornton, it's people like you who can't see past the color of someone's skin or the circumstances of their birth." "Well," Mrs. Thornton sputtered, "I've never been so insulted. Perhaps you should find other accommodations on your next visit to Leavenworth." "Perhaps I should," Thomas agreed. "In fact, I'm certain I will." Adelaide heard Mrs. Thornton's heavy footsteps stomping away, and she finally managed to get her feet moving again. She hurried up the stairs and down the hallway, hoping to reach the linen closet before Thomas emerged, but he stepped out of his room just as she passed. "Adelaide," he said, and she stopped, unable to do anything else. "How much of that did you hear?" "Enough," she admitted, still clutching her basket like a shield. "You shouldn't have said those things. She'll make your life difficult if you come back." "I meant every word." He stepped closer, and Adelaide found herself looking up into his face, seeing the determination there, the conviction. "I'm heading back to Texas tomorrow. I have a ranch about 60 miles south of San Antonio, not much but it's mine. 300 acres and a house I built with my own hands." Adelaide didn't understand why he was telling her this. "That sounds nice, sir." "Thomas," he corrected automatically. Then, "Adelaide, I know this is sudden. I know we barely know each other. But I've been watching you these past few days, seeing how hard you work, how you carry yourself with dignity no matter how you're treated. I've seen the intelligence in your eyes and the kindness in how you treat the other staff, sharing your meals with the younger girls when you think no one's looking." Her face flushed hot. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed that. "What I'm trying to say, and making a mess of it, is that I'd like to know you better. I'd like to give you a chance at something more than this." He took a breath, and Adelaide saw nervousness flicker across his face, this confident man suddenly uncertain. "Come with me to Texas. Not as a servant, not as anything but my equal. I'm asking you to take a chance on me, on a life where you'd be valued and respected. I'm asking you to be my wife, if you'll have me." The basket fell from Adelaide's hands, linen spilling across the hallway floor. She stared at Thomas Vance, certain she'd misheard, certain this was some kind of cruel joke or fevered dream brought on by too many hours bent over wash buckets. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." He didn't move to touch her, didn't crowd her space, just stood there looking at her with an openness that made her chest ache. "I know it's fast. I know you have every reason to be suspicious. But Adelaide, I'm 30 years old and I've spent the last 5 years building something worth having. The only thing missing is someone to share it with, someone who understands what it's like to be judged unfairly, who has the strength to endure and the grace to remain kind despite it." "You don't know me," Adelaide said, her voice shaking. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough. And I'm willing to take the time to know more if you'll let me. If the answer is no, I'll respect that. I'll leave tomorrow and never trouble you again. But if there's any part of you that wants something more than this life, any part of you that's willing to take a risk on something better, then say yes. Come with me. Marry me." Adelaide's mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. Men like Thomas Vance didn't propose to women like her. They used women like her and discarded them, or at best kept them as mistresses, hidden away from respectable society. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no deception, no hidden agenda. She saw only hope and sincerity and a kind of desperate courage that mirrored what she felt rising in her own chest. "I have nothing," she said. "No dowry, no family, no education to speak of. I can read and cipher a bit, but that's all. I can clean and cook and mend, but any woman can do that. What could I possibly bring to a marriage with you?" "Yourself," Thomas said simply. "That's all I'm asking for. Yourself, as you are." Adelaide bent and began gathering the scattered linens, needing something to do with her hands while her thoughts raced. Thomas knelt and helped her, their fingers brushing as they reached for the same pillowcase. The contact sent a jolt through her, electric and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "If I say yes," she said slowly, not looking at him, "if I agree to this, I need to know it's real. I need to know you mean marriage in truth, not just in name. I won't be anyone's convenience or charity case." "I'm offering you marriage in every sense of the word," Thomas said quietly. "A partnership, a life built together. I won't lie and say I'm head over heels in love with you after 3 days, but I feel something when I look at you, something that makes me think we could build something real and lasting. Love takes time, but I think we could find it together, if we're both willing to try." Adelaide looked at him then, really looked at him, searching his face for any hint of falsehood. She found none. What she found instead was a man who seemed as uncertain and hopeful as she felt, a man who was taking as much of a risk as he was asking her to take. "When would we leave?" she asked. Hope flared in his eyes. "Tomorrow morning early. I have a wagon and supplies waiting at the livery. It's a long journey, 3 weeks or more depending on the weather and the state of the roads. We'd be married before we left if you're willing. I know the minister here, Reverend Parker. He'd perform the ceremony." "Reverend Parker's wife raised me after my father died," Adelaide said softly. "She was kind in her way, though she made it clear I was a burden and a charity case." "Then she'll be surprised to see you married to a man with land and prospects," Thomas said, and there was a fierce satisfaction in his voice that made Adelaide's heart skip. She thought about Mrs. Thornton's words, about being told her entire life that she'd never amount to more than a servant, that her mixed blood made her fundamentally unworthy of respect or love. She thought about the endless years stretching ahead of her, scrubbing floors and bowing her head and making herself small and invisible just to survive. And then she thought about the possibility Thomas was offering, the chance at something more, something better, something that terrified her precisely because she wanted it so desperately. "Yes," she said, and the word came out stronger than she expected. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, and Adelaide felt the calluses on her own hands, the roughness that marked them both as workers, as survivors. "You won't regret this," he said. "I promise you, Adelaide, I'll spend every day making sure you don't regret this." The next few hours passed in a blur. Adelaide gave her notice to Mrs. Thornton, who responded with predictable outrage until Thomas made it clear that Adelaide would be leaving as his wife, not his mistress. The woman's face had cycled through several shades of red and purple before settling on a tight-lipped fury that Adelaide found intensely satisfying. She packed her few belongings into a small carpet bag, everything she owned in the world fitting into a space no bigger than a bread box. Thomas waited for her in the lobby, ignoring the stares and whispers of the other guests and staff. When she came down the stairs, he offered her his arm like she was a lady, and Adelaide took it with her head held high. Reverend Parker was confused when they appeared at his door that evening, but after Thomas explained the situation and made it clear that this was a legitimate marriage proposal, not some hasty arrangement born of compromise or desperation. The minister agreed to perform the ceremony. His wife looked Adelaide up and down with barely concealed shock. "Are you certain about this, Adelaide?" Mrs. Parker asked in an undertone. "You barely know this man. What if he's not what he seems?" "Then I'll be no worse off than I am now," Adelaide replied, and realized it was true. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Even if Thomas turned out to be less than he appeared, even if this was all some elaborate mistake, at least she would have tried. At least she would have chosen something for herself, instead of accepting what others decided she deserved. The ceremony was brief and simple. Adelaide wore her cleanest dress, a faded blue cotton that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. Thomas stood beside her in his traveling clothes, and when Reverend Parker asked if he took Adelaide to be his lawfully wedded wife, his "I do" rang out clear and firm. When it was Adelaide's turn, she looked into Thomas's eyes and said, "I do," and meant it with everything she had. They spent their wedding night in separate rooms at a different hotel, the Liberty House on the far side of town. Thomas had been clear that he wouldn't rush her, that they had time to grow into being husband and wife in all senses. Adelaide lay awake most of the night in her narrow bed, alternating between giddy disbelief and terror at what she'd done. She'd married a stranger and agreed to travel hundreds of miles from the only home she'd ever known to a place she'd never seen. By any rational measure, she'd lost her mind. But when morning came and Thomas knocked on her door, when she saw his smile and the careful respect in his eyes, something settled in her chest. Maybe this was madness, but it was her madness, her choice, her chance at something better. They set out before dawn, the wagon loaded with supplies and Adelaide perched on the seat beside Thomas. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, painting the Kansas prairie in shades of gold and rose. Thomas handed her a thick shawl and made sure she was settled comfortably before taking up the reins. "Ready?" he asked. Adelaide looked back at Leavenworth one last time, at the buildings and streets that had contained her entire world for 21 years. She thought she'd feel more sorrow at leaving, but all she felt was a strange, bubbling lightness, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. "Ready," she said. The first days of travel were awkward in the way of two strangers learning to navigate shared space. Thomas drove the wagon during the day, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about his previous journeys along this route. Adelaide listened and asked questions, slowly learning about the man she'd married. He'd been born in Texas to a Mexican mother and an Irish father who died in the war when Thomas was 15. He'd worked cattle drives for years, saving every penny until he had enough to buy land of his own. He'd built his house himself with help from neighbors, had started his herd with a dozen scrub cattle he'd gentled and bred into something better. "It's not grand," he warned her as they crossed into Oklahoma territory. "Not like those big ranches further south. But it's solid and it's paid for, and there's room to grow." "It sounds perfect," Adelaide said honestly. She couldn't imagine anything more appealing than a place that was truly home, that she could put down roots and belong. They camped at night, Thomas setting up a tent for Adelaide while he slept under the wagon. He was scrupulous about giving her privacy, about treating her with a respect that Adelaide still wasn't quite accustomed to. On the fifth night, when a thunderstorm rolled across the plains and rain pounded the canvas above her, Adelaide lay awake listening to the storm and worrying about Thomas getting soaked beneath the wagon. In the morning, she found him shivering and sneezing, his clothes damp despite his oilcloth slicker. "You should have said something," Adelaide scolded, feeling guilty. "You should have taken shelter in the tent." "Wouldn't have been proper," Thomas said, then sneezed again. "We're married," Adelaide pointed out. "Propriety is a bit beside the point now." He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and miserable, and Adelaide felt something shift inside her. This man had turned his life upside down for her, had offered her everything he had and asked for nothing in return. The least she could do was meet him halfway. That night, when Thomas started to set up his bedroll under the wagon, Adelaide stopped him. "The tent is big enough for two," she said, her cheeks hot but her voice steady. "We'll put your bedroll on one side and mine on the other. It's foolish for you to sleep in the rain when there's perfectly good shelter." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but another sneeze changed his mind. "If you're certain—" "I am." They lay on opposite sides of the tent that night, a careful distance between them, and Adelaide listened to Thomas's breathing gradually even out as he fell asleep. She found the sound oddly comforting, the knowledge that she wasn't alone in the darkness. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she felt safe. As the journey continued, the awkwardness between them gradually eased into something more comfortable. Thomas taught Adelaide to handle the reins, sitting close beside her to guide her hands until she got the feel of it. Adelaide took over more of the camp duties, cooking their meals and managing their supplies with the efficiency she'd learned from years of hotel work. They talked as they traveled, long conversations that ranged from the profound to the mundane, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. Adelaide told Thomas about her mother, the Shoshone woman who died bringing her into the world, and how she'd grown up with no connection to that part of her heritage. Thomas told her about his mother, about the songs she'd sung in Spanish and the stories she'd told of Mexico, about how she'd died of fever when he was 12, and how his father had never quite recovered from losing her. He loved her, Thomas said one evening as they sat by the fire. Really loved her, not in spite of who she was but because of it. I want that kind of love, the kind that sees a person whole and chooses them anyway. Adelaide looked at him across the dancing flames and felt her heart beat faster. "Is that why you asked me to marry you?" "Part of it," Thomas admitted. "I saw you and I saw someone strong and capable and kind despite having every reason not to be. I saw someone who deserved better than what life had given her. And I saw someone I thought I could build a life with if she was willing." "I was so afraid it was pity," Adelaide confessed, "that you felt sorry for me and wanted to rescue me like some kind of damsel in a story." "If anyone was doing the rescuing, it was you rescuing me," Thomas said with a smile. "I was getting tired of being alone, of coming home to an empty house. I was starting to wonder if I'd spend my whole life that way. And now I'm hopeful," he said simply, "more hopeful than I've been in a long time." They crossed into Texas on the 17th day of their journey, and Adelaide felt something loosen in her chest. This was Thomas's home territory, and he visibly relaxed as they traveled familiar roads. He pointed out landmarks, told her about the people who lived in the scattered homesteads they passed, painted a picture of the community she was joining. "Are they going to accept me?" Adelaide asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as they drew closer to their destination. "Will they treat me the way people did in Leavenworth?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Adelaide appreciated that he didn't offer her false comfort. "Some will," he said finally. "I won't lie about that, but most folks out here are too busy surviving to care much about bloodlines. They care whether you pull your weight, whether you're a good neighbor, whether you keep your word. Show them that and they'll come around. And if they don't, then we'll make our own community, just the two of us." He reached over and took her hand, the gesture still new enough to send a thrill through her. "You're not alone anymore, Adelaide. Whatever comes, we face it together." The Vance Ranch, when they finally reached it on the 20th day of travel, was everything Thomas had described and more. The house was small but solid, built of lumber and stone with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze. There was a barn and a corral, a chicken coop, and a well with a bucket that actually worked. 300 acres of grassland stretched out in every direction, dotted with mesquite trees and home to a herd of about 50 cattle that Thomas pointed out with obvious pride. "It's not much yet," he said as they pulled up in front of the house, "but it's ours." Adelaide climbed down from the wagon and stood looking at the house, at this place that was now her home. She thought about the cramped servants' quarters she'd lived in at the hotel, the narrow cot, and the trunk that held all her worldly possessions. She thought about being told daily that she should be grateful for even that much, that someone like her deserved nothing better. "It's everything," she said, and burst into tears. Thomas was off the wagon in an instant, pulling her into his arms and holding her while she sobbed against his chest. He didn't ask her to explain or tell her not to cry, just held her and let her release years of pent-up hurt and fear and desperate, fragile hope. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by her display, he gently wiped her tears away with his thumbs. "Welcome home, Adelaide," he said softly. Those first weeks at the ranch were a period of adjustment and discovery. Adelaide threw herself into making the house a home, cleaning and organizing and cooking meals that made Thomas's eyes light up with pleasure. She learned to tend the chickens and milk the cow, to manage the vegetable garden that grew stubbornly in the Texas heat, to make soap and candles, and all the 100 little things that kept a household running. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk, tending the cattle and mending fences and doing the endless labor that ranch life required. But he always came in for meals, always took time in the evenings to sit with Adelaide on the porch and talk about their days. They were still careful with each other, still navigating the strange intimacy of being married but not yet truly knowing each other, sharing a house but not yet a bed. It was Adelaide who finally changed that, 6 weeks after their arrival at the ranch. She'd been watching Thomas, seeing the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the careful distance he kept even as his eyes followed her movements around the house. She'd been feeling the same pull, the growing desire not just for physical closeness but for true partnership, for the kind of marriage they'd promised each other in Reverend Parker's parlor. One night, after Thomas had retired to the room he'd been using while Adelaide took the main bedroom, she got out of bed and walked down the hallway. She knocked softly on his door, her heart hammering. "Thomas, can I come in?" There was a pause, then the sound of movement. The door opened and Thomas stood there in his sleeping clothes, hair mussed and eyes concerned. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," Adelaide said. "Everything's right, that's the problem." At his confused look, she pushed on before she lost her nerve. "We've been married almost 2 months. We've traveled hundreds of miles together. We've built a home together, but we're still living like strangers. I don't want that anymore, Thomas. I want a real marriage. I want you." She watched several emotions cross his face: surprise, hope, desire, and underneath it all, love. Not the burning passion of a romance novel, but something steadier and deeper, the kind of love built on respect and shared struggles and choosing each other every day. "Are you sure?" he asked, and his voice was rough with restrained emotion. "I've never been more sure of anything." Thomas reached out and took her hand, pulling her gently into the room. "I've been waiting for you to be ready," he said. "I didn't want to rush you, didn't want you to feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," Adelaide said, stepping closer. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He kissed her then, carefully at first and then with growing passion, and Adelaide felt the last walls between them crumble. That night, they became husband and wife in truth, and when Adelaide woke the next morning wrapped in Thomas's arms, she felt like she'd finally found the home she'd been searching for her entire life. The seasons turned, and their life together deepened and grew. Adelaide proved to be a natural with the ranch work, taking over the management of the household and the garden with the same efficiency she'd shown at the hotel, but now working for herself and her husband rather than for someone who saw her as less than human. Thomas taught her to ride, putting her on his gentlest mare and leading her around the corral until she got her confidence. Soon she was riding out with him to check on the cattle, the two of them working side by side. The neighbors, when Adelaide finally met them, were a mixed group. Some were welcoming, happy to have another woman in the area and unconcerned about her heritage. Others were cooler, their greetings polite but distant. Adelaide held her head high and treated everyone with respect, letting her actions speak for her character. Slowly, grudgingly, even the most skeptical began to come around. It was Sarah Hendricks, the wife of the nearest neighbor, who became Adelaide's first real friend. She was a practical woman in her 40s with 6 children and a laugh that could be heard across the prairie. She showed up at the Vance ranch 3 months after Adelaide's arrival with a basket of preserves and a frank, appraising look. "Heard Tom Vance got himself a wife," she said without preamble. "Heard she was a half-breed from Kansas, and half the county's been gossiping about it. Thought I'd come see for myself." Adelaide had tensed, waiting for judgment, but Sarah just smiled. "You keep a neat house," she continued, looking around approvingly, "and those are healthy chickens. Tom looks happier than I've ever seen him. That's good enough for me. Now, are you going to invite me in for coffee, or are we going to stand out here all day?" From that day forward, Sarah was a regular visitor and a staunch defender. When Adelaide heard gossip about herself at the general store in town, she knew Sarah had already been there first, singing her praises and daring anyone to say otherwise. It was a gift Adelaide had never expected, the gift of friendship freely given. The first year of their marriage passed in a rhythm of work and growing love. Thomas proved to be exactly what he'd promised, a partner in every sense of the word. He valued Adelaide's opinions, sought her counsel on ranch decisions, treated her as an equal. When she suggested they try breeding a different line of cattle, he listened, and they experimented together. When the garden failed during a dry spell, he helped her haul water from the creek until the plants revived. They learned each other's bodies and hearts with equal care, building a physical intimacy that matched their emotional connection. Adelaide had been afraid, those first few times, that the reality of marriage would be nothing like the hope of it. But Thomas was gentle and patient, and passion grew between them naturally, a fire that burned steady and warm rather than wild and consuming. In the spring of their second year together, Adelaide realized she was pregnant. She'd been feeling tired and queasy for weeks, had missed her monthly courses, but she'd been almost afraid to hope. When she finally told Thomas, his whoop of joy could probably be heard all the way at the Hendricks place. He swept her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down and fussed over whether he'd been too rough, whether she should sit down, whether she needed anything. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Adelaide laughed. But she was crying too, overwhelmed by happiness and fear in equal measure. The pregnancy was difficult at times. The Texas heat seemed unbearable that summer, and Adelaide spent many afternoons resting in the coolest room of the house while Thomas hovered worriedly. But Sarah Hendricks was there with advice and practical help, and the other ranch wives gradually warmed to Adelaide, seeing her as one of them now, tied to the land and the life through the child she carried. Adelaide's labor began on a cold November evening, earlier than expected. Thomas sent for Sarah while Adelaide gripped the bedpost and tried to remember how to breathe. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Adelaide thought she wouldn't survive it, thought she understood too well now how her own mother had died bringing her into the world. But Sarah was there, calm and capable, and Thomas held Adelaide's hand and whispered encouragement even when she cursed him for doing this to her. And finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born, red-faced and screaming his arrival into the world. "A boy," Sarah announced, cutting the cord and wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "A healthy, strong boy." Thomas was crying openly as he took his son, looking down at the tiny face with such wonder that Adelaide felt her heart might burst. He brought the baby to her, placing him carefully in her arms, and Adelaide looked down at her child, at this perfect little person who was half her and half Thomas, and felt something settle deep in her soul. "What should we name him?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Adelaide thought about all the people who'd told her she'd never be more than a servant, that her blood made her unworthy of love or respect or a real life. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the risks she'd taken and the love she'd found. She thought about new beginnings and the future they were building. "Samuel," she said, "after my father's father, the only person in my father's family who ever tried to help us. Samuel Jacob Vance." "It's perfect," Thomas said. "He's perfect. You're perfect." Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he thrived in the warm Texas air. Adelaide took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning as she went and relying on Sarah's advice when she felt overwhelmed. Thomas was a devoted father, coming in from the fields multiple times a day just to check on his son, holding the baby in his work-roughened hands with infinite tenderness. The years flowed by, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their family. 2 years after Samuel came Emma, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Then, 3 years later, twins, Michael and Rose, who kept Adelaide and Thomas running ragged with their boundless energy. The ranch grew too. They added more land, expanded the herd, built a bigger barn and hired on a couple of hands to help with the work. Adelaide's garden became the envy of the county, and she sold her surplus vegetables in town for prices that would have shocked her younger self. Thomas's reputation as a fair dealer and a good neighbor spread, and people came from miles around to buy his cattle. Adelaide became known in her own right, not as Thomas's wife but as herself. She helped birth babies and tend the sick when the doctor was too far away. She taught some of the neighbor children to read when their families couldn't afford school. She gave refuge to a young Mexican girl fleeing an abusive situation, standing up to the girl's family when they came demanding her return. And the story spread until Adelaide Vance was known as someone who stood up for people who had no one else. It wasn't always easy. There were still people who looked down on her, who made comments about her heritage or treated her as less than equal. But now she had Thomas beside her, and her children, and a community that largely accepted her. The gossip couldn't touch her the way it once had, because she knew her worth now. She'd built it with her own hands, carved it out of the Texas soil, proved it with every day she lived. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Adelaide up to the ridge that overlooked their property. They sat together on their horses, looking down at the house and barns, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at their children playing in the yard under Sarah Hendricks's watchful eye. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Saying yes to a stranger and leaving everything you knew?" Adelaide thought about the girl she'd been, scrubbing floors in a Kansas hotel and believing she'd never be more than a servant. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong and capable and loved. She thought about the family she'd built and the home she'd made and the life she'd claimed for herself. "Not for a single second," she said, and meant it with everything she had. "I love you," Thomas said, not for the first time but with the same sincerity as always. "I thank God every day that you took a chance on me." "I love you too," Adelaide replied, leaning over to kiss him. "You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. You saw me as a person when the rest of the world saw me as nothing. You made me your wife and your partner and the mother of your children. How could I regret that?" They sat together on the ridge as the sun set, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere below, one of the children called out, and they could hear Sarah's laughter in response. The cattle lowed contentedly, and a warm breeze carried the scent of mesquite and sage. Adelaide thought about fate and choice, about how a single moment of courage could change everything. She thought about Mrs. Thornton and Leavenworth, and the life she'd left behind. She wondered if anyone there ever thought about her, the half-breed servant girl who'd married a cowboy and disappeared into Texas. She hoped they did. She hoped they wondered and gossiped and couldn't quite believe that Adelaide Zimmerman had found happiness. Because she had. Against all odds and expectations, she'd found a man who saw her worth, who'd offered her everything and asked only that she be herself. She'd found love and home and a place where she belonged. As they rode back down to the house, Thomas reached over and took her hand, and Adelaide squeezed back, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the physical evidence of lives built through hard work and dedication. She thought about the future stretching ahead of them, about watching their children grow, about growing old beside the man who'd chosen her when the world said she was unworthy of choosing. Samuel ran to meet them as they approached, his 8-year-old legs pumping hard, his face lit with excitement about something he'd discovered in the barn. Emma followed at a more dignified pace, carrying Rose on her hip while Michael chased chickens in circles. Adelaide dismounted and scooped up her son, listening to his breathless explanation about the new kittens the barn cat had hidden in the hay loft. Thomas took Rose from Emma and lifted her high, making her shriek with laughter. Michael abandoned the chickens and attached himself to his father's leg, demanding to be lifted too. Sarah stood on the porch, smiling at the chaos, and called out that supper would be ready soon. This was Adelaide's life now. Not perfect, because nothing ever was, but good and real and hers. She'd been told she'd never be more than a servant, that her blood made her unworthy of respect or love. But a cowboy had looked past all that and said, "You'll be my wife if you'll have me." And she'd said yes, and it had changed everything. That night, after the children were in bed and Sarah had headed home and the ranch was quiet, Adelaide and Thomas sat on their porch as they did most evenings. Thomas had his arm around her shoulders, and Adelaide leaned into his warmth, feeling completely at peace. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked. "About how far we've come," Adelaide said. "About how different my life is from what I thought it would be." "Better, so much better," she confirmed. "Sometimes I wake up and can hardly believe it's real that I get to have this life, this family, you." "Believe it," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "This is real and it's ours, and we've got years ahead of us to make it even better." Adelaide believed him. She believed in the strength of what they'd built together, in the love that had grown from that improbable beginning in a Kansas hotel. She believed in the family they'd created and the legacy they were building for their children. She believed that sometimes, even when the world told you that you were nothing and would never be anything more, there could be someone who saw your worth and was willing to bet everything on you. She'd been that person's servant. Now she was his wife, his partner, his equal, the mother of his children and the keeper of his heart. And he was all those things to her as well. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for, more than anyone had told her she deserved. But she'd learned that what people told you and what was true were often two very different things. She'd learned that courage and hope could change your destiny, that love could be found in unexpected places, that you could build something beautiful out of broken pieces if you were willing to try. The stars came out above them, bright and countless in the Texas sky, and Adelaide felt the rightness of where she was, of who she'd become. She'd been told she'd never be more than a servant. A cowboy had said she'd be his wife if she'd have him. And in saying yes to that impossible offer, she'd found not just a husband but a home, not just a marriage but a purpose, not just survival but a life worth living. The future stretched ahead of them, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges still, she knew that. There would be hard times and harder decisions, losses and struggles and moments of doubt. But they would face it all together, Thomas and Adelaide Vance, partners in every sense of the word, building their legacy one day at a time. And years from now, when their children asked about how their parents met, Adelaide would tell them the truth. She'd tell them about a girl who'd been told she was worthless, and a man who'd seen her value. She'd tell them about courage and risk and love that grew from respect and partnership. She'd tell them that sometimes the best things in life come from the chances you take when everyone tells you to play it safe. She'd tell them that she'd been a servant who became a wife, a nobody who became somebody, all because she'd been brave enough to say yes when opportunity knocked. And she'd tell them to never let anyone define their worth, to never accept limitations others tried to impose, to always believe that they deserved more than the world might initially offer. Because Adelaide had learned that lesson the hard way, and she'd be damned if her children would have to struggle through the same doubt and fear. They would grow up knowing they were loved and valued, knowing they could be anything they wanted to be, knowing that their mother had fought for the life they had and won. Thomas shifted beside her, and Adelaide turned to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into that simple gesture. When they pulled apart, he was smiling, that warm, open smile that had first made her brave enough to trust him all those years ago. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said. "Happy anniversary," Adelaide replied. "Here's to the next 10 years and the 10 after that and all the years until we're old and gray and still sitting on this porch together." "I'll drink to that," Thomas said, and they sat together in the gathering darkness. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting, something true, something worth every risk they'd taken to get there. The end.